The air was thick with disbelief as Helga Schneider stood frozen at the edge of Camp Trinidad's mess hall on April 7, 1944. The 23-year-old, former nurse of the Wehrmacht Women's Auxiliary, had spent 3 years believing American men were mostly fictional, characters, propaganda inventions designed to frighten German soldiers with tales of savage cowboys and brutal lumberjacks. Yet here before her stood 237 American servicemen, many of whom bore an uncanny resemblance to the very caricatures she had been taught to dismiss as fantasy. Tall, broad-shouldered men with weathered faces and calloused hands moved with a casual confidence that seemed impossible to reconcile with the malnourished, desperate enemy she had been indoctrinated to expect. "I thought they were actors at first," Helga later wrote in a letter smuggled to her sister, "men hired to intimidate us. But there were too many, hundreds upon hundreds of them, real cowboys who had left ranches to fight, lumberjacks with arms thicker than our legs, factory workers who looked better fed than our generals. What I saw that day defied 12 years of indoctrination in a single moment," Helga was one of 342 female German military personnel captured in North Africa and transported to auxiliary POW camps in the American Southwest. These women, nurses, communications specialists, and administrative staff, had been raised on carefully constructed myths about America and its people. Through Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda, they had been taught that America was a paper tiger, a nation of immigrants with no unified culture, hobbled by racial tensions, weakened by decadence, and led by Jewish financiers who manipulated a population of cowboys, gangsters, and primitive laborers. The Deutschland radio broadcasts of 1942 had specifically portrayed American men as either effeminate intellectuals or brutish simpletons playing at war, neither capable of matching the discipline and racial superiority of the German fighting man. Official Wehrmacht training materials recovered after the war revealed systematic efforts to convince German forces that American military capacity had been grossly exaggerated, that American industry could not sustain a two-front war, and that American men lacked the physical fortitude and spiritual will to engage in prolonged combat. Such propaganda served a critical purpose. By 1943, Germany was experiencing severe resource shortages. Civilian rations had been cut to 1,500 calories per day, less than half the average American civilian consumption of 3,200 calories. German soldiers received 1 ounce of real coffee per month. Their American counterparts received unlimited quantities. German military personnel were limited to 2 uniforms for the duration. American troops received fresh clothing as needed. These disparities were known to German high command, but concealed from ordinary soldiers and citizens through elaborate misinformation campaigns. Captain Heinrich Müller of German military intelligence later testified at Nuremberg that "We knew America's industrial capacity exceeded ours by factors of 5 to 7, but to admit this would destroy morale." The myth of the inferior American fighting man was essential to maintaining the illusion that victory remained possible. The stage was set for a profound psychological shock when Germans, particularly German women raised in the rigid gender hierarchy of the Third Reich, encountered actual American men in all their varied forms. What made this encounter especially jarring was the contrast between expectation and reality, between propaganda and truth, between manufactured myth and the overwhelming evidence of American abundance personified in its male citizens. Reichsminister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels had personally approved a 1941 educational film titled The American Man, A Study in Degeneracy, which portrayed American males as either effeminate weaklings corrupted by Jewish influence or brutish cowboys and gangsters, incapable of sophisticated military operations. The film, shown to all Wehrmacht personnel, including the Women's Auxiliary Corps, emphasized that American men were physically inferior to German soldiers, lacking both discipline and fighting spirit. This calculated mythology was designed to address a frightening reality. By 1942, American factories were producing more aircraft, tanks, artillery pieces, and ammunition than all Axis powers combined. The Third Reich needed a narrative to explain how a supposedly inferior people could generate such overwhelming material superiority. The answer was to attribute American production to exploitation, claiming that a small Jewish elite was working the American population to death while German production represented the honest effort of a racially superior people. For women like Helga Schneider and her fellow prisoners, this narrative framework had shaped their understanding of the world since Hitler's rise to power. They had been raised in the Bund Deutscher, Mädel, the female wing of Hitler Youth, where they were taught that German men represented the apex of human evolution, and that American men were racial degenerates suffering from cultural and spiritual corruption. The idea that these same Americans could be better fed, better equipped, and physically imposing was not merely surprising, it represented a fundamental threat to their entire worldview. As the female POWs were processed into the American camp system, this cognitive dissonance would only intensify. Each encounter with American abundance, each interaction with the very cowboys and lumberjacks they had been taught, were mere propaganda inventions, chipped away at the ideological foundation upon which they had built their identities. What followed was not simply a prisoner of war experience, but a systematic dismantling of beliefs through overwhelming evidence of American superiority in the most material sense. The journey that would lead 342 female German military personnel to confront this reality began in the deserts of North Africa. Captured during the final phases of the Tunisia campaign in May 1943, these women had served primarily as nurses, communication specialists, and administrative personnel supporting Rommel's Afrika Korps. Unlike their male counterparts, they had been specifically targeted with propaganda emphasizing the savagery of American troops, with special warnings about the threat of sexual violence from the supposedly primitive American fighting men. "We were told to save the last bullet for ourselves," recalled Frieda Muller, a 26-year-old radio operator captured near Bizerte. "Our commanding officer, Major Hoffman, told us that American soldiers were largely drawn from prisons and insane asylums, that many were cowboys who had never seen a European woman and would not be able to control their base instincts." The initial capture experience immediately began to undermine these expectations. Instead of the anticipated brutality, the women encountered structured military protocol. Staff Sergeant James Williams of the 1st Infantry Division, who participated in processing female German prisoners, noted in his field report, "The German women appeared genuinely surprised by our standard procedures. Several asked when the real Americans would arrive to interrogate them, apparently expecting some kind of movie cowboys instead of regular soldiers." This first contradiction, professional soldiers rather than savage cowboys, was just the beginning. After initial processing, the female prisoners were transported by military ship to the United States. The voyage itself presented further evidence that contradicted their expectations. The prisoners received the same rations as their American guards, 2,800 calories daily, including meat at every meal, fresh fruit, and even chocolate. For women who had been subsisting on increasingly meager German military rations, this abundance was shocking. Erika Lehmann, a 24-year-old nurse, recorded her impressions in a diary, later confiscated by American intelligence. "We are being fattened for some purpose I don't understand. Today I received more meat than I would see in a month in Berlin. When I asked why we were being given such luxury, the American guard looked genuinely confused and said, 'This is just normal food, ma'am.' If this is normal, what must their special meals be like?" The true shock, however, came when the women arrived on American soil. First at Fort Patrick in Virginia for initial processing, then at specialized camps in the Southwest designed for female prisoners. They encountered an America that was not merely different from the propaganda image, it was its complete antithesis. Here were not the starving masses they had been told to expect, but seemingly endless supplies of everything: food, clothing, fuel, and manufactured goods. The Camp Trinidad facility in Colorado, where many of the female German military personnel were housed, became the site of profound disorientation. Built to American military specifications, The camp featured amenities that many of the women had not experienced even in peacetime Germany: reliable hot water, central heating, abundant electrical lighting, and nutritional standards that exceeded those of German officers. It was at Camp Trinidad that Helga Schneider had her first encounter with actual American cowboys. The camp employed several local ranchers as civilian staff, men who quite literally had left their horses and cattle to support the war effort. These men, tall, physically powerful, and distinctly unconcerned with projecting military discipline, were living embodiments of a character type the German women had been taught was largely fictional. Otto Müller, a camp interpreter who interviewed many of the women, reported the female prisoners could not reconcile what they saw with what they had been told. One woman, a university graduate, asked me in all seriousness if the Americans had built fake towns and brought actors to populate them just to fool German prisoners. She could not accept that ordinary Americans lived better than German elites. This disbelief extended to virtually every aspect of American life, the prisoners observed. When shown the standard mail order, Sears catalog as part of their orientation, a measure designed to help them understand what items they could purchase with their prisoner work credits, many women initially insisted it was fabricated propaganda. The catalog's 167 pages featured more consumer goods than were available in all of Berlin, and at prices that suggested even working-class Americans could afford luxuries reserved for the wealthy in Germany. Margaret Fisher, a 30-year-old communications specialist, wrote, "They showed us a book from which ordinary Americans order goods. It contains everything one could imagine. Refrigerators, radios, clothing, furniture. When I said this must be only for the rich, the guard showed me his pay book and explained that he had purchased a refrigerator on his sergeant's salary for his wife. A refrigerator! My family in Hamburg has been on a waiting list for one since 1938. The confrontation with American material abundance was systematically reinforced through the prisoners' daily experiences. The camp's mess hall served 3,200 calories daily, more than twice what German civilians received. The menu included items that had disappeared from German tables years earlier: real coffee, sugar, butter, eggs, and meat at every meal. For women who had spent years managing increasingly severe rationing, the casual waste they observed was perhaps even more shocking than the abundance itself. Ingrid Weber, a 22-year-old former Hitler Youth leader captured in Tunisia, noted with astonishment, "The Americans throw away more food than we eat. Today I watched a kitchen worker discard a whole tray of rolls because they were slightly overbaked. In Munich, people would fight for those scraps." This pattern of abundance followed by waste appeared in every aspect of camp life. Prisoners received new clothing when old items wore out, without question or rationing. Hot water flowed without restriction. The camp's garbage revealed discarded items that would have been treasured possessions in wartime Germany. Each observation reinforced a terrible truth: America was not conserving resources for the war effort because it didn't need to. American abundance was so complete that even prisoners of war lived better than German civilians. The breaking point for many women came during their first Christmas in captivity. Following Geneva Convention guidelines, the American camp authorities permitted the German prisoners to organize a holiday celebration. The camp provided not only additional food, including ingredients for traditional German Christmas cookies that many women hadn't seen since before the war, but also materials for decorations, musical instruments, and even small gifts for each prisoner. Helga Schneider's letter to her sister described the experience. "The Americans gave us real coffee, white flour, butter, sugar, and chocolate to make Christmas cookies. When I told the supply sergeant that in Germany such ingredients would be impossible to obtain, he seemed genuinely confused. 'Ma'am, we've got warehouses full of this stuff,' he said. 'This isn't even a drop in the bucket.' I realized then that we could never win this war. How can you defeat an enemy who has warehouses full of what your own generals cannot obtain?" The psychological impact deepened as the women were permitted to work in various capacities around the camp and in approved local businesses. Those assigned to the camp's administrative offices witnessed the sheer scale of American military logistics. Supply manifests showed not hundreds or thousands, but millions of items moving through the military supply chain. 3 million pairs of boots, 2 million helmets, 5 million uniforms. The numbers were so large as to seem fictional, yet the evidence of this capacity surrounded them. Those permitted to work in local Colorado businesses encountered another shock: the American civilian. Far from the downtrodden workers they had been led to expect, ordinary Americans appeared well-fed, well-dressed, and remarkably unconcerned about basic material needs. They owned automobiles, not just the wealthy, but ordinary workers. They lived in houses with electrical appliances. They purchased consumer goods that had been unavailable in Germany even before the war. Frieda Weber, assigned to clerical duties at a local canning factory, wrote in a letter later confiscated by censors, "The women working here complain about rationing. I asked what items they cannot get, thinking they meant bread or potatoes. They said nylon stockings and automobile tires. They don't understand what real shortage means. The factory manager showed me production figures. This single facility produces more canned goods in a day than my entire district in Hamburg receives in a month." For women raised in the Nazi ideological system, which emphasized German cultural and racial superiority, these revelations represented more than just surprise at American prosperity. They constituted a fundamental threat to their core beliefs. If Americans, those supposedly mongrelized, culturally inferior people, could produce such abundance, what did that imply about the supposed superiority of German society? If cowboys and lumberjacks lived better than German professionals, how could the Nazi racial hierarchy be defended? This question became explicit when the women encountered American soldiers of varied ethnic backgrounds. German propaganda had emphasized American racial tensions, portraying the United States as weakened by diversity. Yet the prisoners observed Black, Hispanic, and white American soldiers working together effectively, all apparently well-fed, well-equipped, and confident in their nation's inevitable victory. Maria Schmidt, a 28-year-old nurse who had been a dedicated Nazi Party member, described her disorientation in a diary entry. "Today I saw something impossible according to everything I was taught. A Negro officer giving orders to white soldiers who obeyed without question. When I asked our guard about this, he shrugged and said, 'Lieutenant Robinson is a good officer,' as if the man's competence were all that mattered. If this is possible, what else have I been wrong about?" As months passed, the accumulated evidence of American material superiority began to produce measurable changes in the prisoners. Medical records from Camp Trinidad show that the average female German prisoner gained 13 pounds within 3 months of arrival. Their health indicators improved across all measures: better dental health, fewer vitamin deficiencies, and a resolution of chronic conditions that had been exacerbated by years of European food shortages. Dr. Samuel Weinstein, the camp's medical director, noted in his quarterly report, "The physical transformation of the German female prisoners has been remarkable. Many arrived with conditions consistent with long-term nutritional deficiency. Within 6 months, these conditions have largely resolved. Their improved physical state appears to be having significant psychological effects." As the women come to terms with what these changes reveal about conditions in their homeland versus America, this physical transformation paralleled an ideological one. Intelligence officers monitoring prisoner communications noted a marked change in tone over time. Initial letters and conversations had frequently contained assertions of eventual German victory and Nazi ideological statements. By 1944, such expressions had largely disappeared, replaced by questions about American life and systems. The women's questions became increasingly specific, moving from disbelief to curiosity. How could America produce so much? How were American factories organized? How did American agriculture generate such surpluses? How could ordinary workers afford automobiles and electrical appliances? These were not merely questions about material conditions, but inquiries that struck at the heart of Nazi economic and social theories. The Camp Trinidad education officer, Lieutenant William Peterson, established voluntary classes on American history, government, and economics, initially as part of the camp's rehabilitation program. To his surprise, participation among the female prisoners approached 100%. Their questions revealed the extent of their ideological disruption. Having discovered that American material abundance was real, they now sought to understand how such a system functioned, and, by extension, how they had been deceived about its possibility. "I expected resistance to these classes," Peterson wrote in his monthly report. Instead, the women display an almost desperate hunger for information. One prisoner, a former economics student, broke down in tears during a lecture on American agricultural productivity. When I asked what was wrong, she said, "We were told this was impossible, that no system could produce such abundance except through exploitation. But I see no exploitation here." The most dramatic confrontations with American reality came for prisoners permitted to work on local Colorado ranches and farms under supervision. Here they encountered the very cowboys and rural workers who had featured so prominently in Nazi caricatures of American masculinity. Rather than the brutish simpletons of propaganda, they found skilled professionals managing complex operations with sophisticated understanding of their work. Carl Weber, a ranch owner who employed several female prisoners through the camp work program, recalled, "These German women would watch everything with such intensity. One asked to see my home, apparently expecting some kind of primitive cabin. When I showed her my ranch house with indoor plumbing, electric refrigerator, and radio, she became very quiet. Later, through an interpreter, she asked how many years of saving it had taken to afford such luxuries. She was stunned when I said these were common features in most rural American homes. The question of machinery and equipment generated particular astonishment. German propaganda had acknowledged American mechanical ability, but portrayed it as a poor substitute for German craftsmanship and quality. Yet the prisoners observed American farms operating with mechanical equipment that had no equivalent in German agriculture. Combines that could harvest more in a day than a German farm could in a week. Irrigation systems that transformed arid land into productive fields, and transportation networks that moved produce efficiently to markets. Erika Lehman, who worked sorting produce at a local distribution center, wrote, "I calculated that this facility moves more food in one day than my entire home city receives in a week." When I asked the manager if this was their maximum capacity, he laughed and said they were operating at about 60%. The scale is incomprehensible. No wonder they can afford to feed us so well as prisoners. Food is simply not a concern for them. The industrial capacity these women witnessed extended far beyond food production. Those assigned to work details in Colorado Springs saw automobile repair shops with tools and parts that would have been precious resources in Germany. They observed construction projects using materials that German builders could no longer obtain. They watched as new public buildings were completed despite the war effort, using resources that seemed inexhaustible. Frida Mueller's letter to her brother, later intercepted by American intelligence, conveyed this growing awareness. "Carl, everything we were told about American industrial weakness was a lie. I work in an office where I see production reports. A single American factory produces more ammunition in a day than all the factories in our district combined. And there are hundreds of such factories. They don't worry about conservation or shortages. They worry about transportation, how to move the endless supply of materials quickly enough. We are not losing this war because of Jewish conspiracies or American cowardice. We are losing because we are fighting a nation that can produce more in a month than we can in a year." The encounters with American men, particularly wives, those from rural and working-class backgrounds, proved especially disorienting for women raised in the Nazi gender hierarchy. German propaganda had emphasized that American men had been weakened by female influence, portrayed as either effeminate intellectuals or uncontrolled primitives. The reality they observed was entirely different. Confident, capable men who treated women with casual respect rather than either condescension or aggression. Helga Schneider described her observations in a journal entry that camp authorities later translated. "The American men are nothing like we were told. The cowboys and lumberjacks who seemed so ridiculous in our propaganda films are actually skilled professionals. They operate complex machinery, manage large operations, and make decisions without constant supervision. And most shocking, they speak to us, enemy women, with the same casual respect they show their female colleagues. No grand chivalry or exaggerated courtesy, just matter-of-fact recognition of competence." I find myself wondering what other lies I have believed. As these revelations accumulated, the women's psychological responses progressed through predictable stages: initial disbelief and denial, followed by anger at having been deceived, then a period of information seeking, and finally a painful reassessment of core beliefs. Intelligence officers monitoring prisoner communications noted that this process typically took 6 to 8 months, with the most committed Nazi believers requiring longer to acknowledge the evidence before them. The case of Margaret Fischer exemplifies this transformation. A devoted Nazi Party member who had served as a Women's League leader before joining the military, Margaret initially responded to American abundance with stubborn denial. Her early letters home, passed through censors, insisted that what she was witnessing was an elaborate deception, sets constructed like a Hollywood movie to break German morale. By her 6th month at Camp Trinidad, her correspondence showed a significant shift. "I no longer believe we are seeing a staged America. No nation could maintain such an extensive deception. What we see daily is the real America, and it is a place of material abundance beyond anything I could have imagined. The question that haunts me now is why our leaders told us otherwise. What purpose did these lies serve, except to send us confidently into a war we could not win?" By the end of 1944, as Allied advances made Germany's defeat increasingly certain, the psychological transformation of the female prisoners accelerated. Having accepted the reality of American abundance, they began to grapple with its implications, not just for the war's outcome, but for their understanding of history, economics, and social organization. The most painful question emerged repeatedly in prisoner communications: if Nazi leadership had been so wrong about America's capabilities, what else had they been wrong about? Captain Maria Schultz, the highest-ranking female prisoner at Camp Trinidad, summarized this crisis in a letter to a fellow officer in another camp. "Our defeat was inevitable from the moment America entered the war. The productive capacity I have witnessed here makes that clear. One American factory produces more than an entire German district. One American farm feeds more people than a German county. Their waste exceeds our carefully managed supplies. This is not merely a military defeat. It is the collapse of everything we were taught about our supposed superiority. The men we were told were inferior, these cowboys and factory workers, live better than our highest officials. How do we make sense of such a world?" This question, how to reconcile observed reality with years of indoctrination, dominated the prisoners' psychological experience in the war's final months. For many, the answer involved a complete rejection of Nazi ideology and a painful examination of personal complicity in a system built on falsehoods. Others attempted to preserve core beliefs while accepting that they had been misinformed about specific aspects of American capacity. But none could fully maintain the worldview they had held before encountering the overwhelming evidence of American material superiority. The systematic documentation of this transformation was possible because American intelligence services recognized its propaganda value. Female prisoners were permitted to write letters home that would pass through German censors, knowing that their descriptions of American conditions would be dismissed as coerced propaganda. Yet, these same women were actively counseled to write to friends and family in other POW camps where their observations would be taken more seriously. This strategy created a network of information spreading through the German prisoner population, gradually undermining Nazi indoctrination through first-hand testimony from trusted sources. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Thompson, who oversaw intelligence operations at several POW facilities, noted in his final wartime report, "The female German prisoners have proven unexpectedly valuable in our psychological operations. Their detailed descriptions of American abundance, particularly when shared with male POWs through approved channels, have dramatically accelerated the demoralization process. Their testimony carries unique credibility precisely because Nazi ideology had emphasized female impressionability. The male prisoners reasoned that if even women can see through the propaganda, it must be obviously false." As the war in Europe approached its conclusion in early 1945, American authorities implemented a more structured re-education program for prisoners who would eventually be repatriated to Germany. The female prisoners at Camp Trinidad became enthusiastic participants, with many volunteering to serve as instructors for newly arrived prisoners. Having navigated their own painful reconciliation with reality, they now helped others process similar disillusionment. Frida Miller, who had arrived as a committed Nazi supporter, became one of the most effective instructors in the camp's democracy program. Her transformation illustrates the profound impact of confronting American material reality. "I believed we were the master race, superior in all ways. Then I saw how ordinary Americans live, the cowboys and factory workers who were supposedly our inferiors. They had refrigerators when our party leaders had none. They had automobiles when our generals struggled to obtain fuel. Their abundant food, their casual waste, their massive factories, each fact was a blow to everything I had believed. If we were superior, how could they have so much more? The only possible answer was that our entire system was built on lies." This realization extended beyond material comparisons to fundamental questions about political and social systems. The prisoners observed that American abundance was not reserved for elites, but distributed broadly through society. Workers lived in conditions that would be considered luxurious by German middle-class standards. Farmers owned their land and equipment rather than serving at the pleasure of the state. These observations directly contradicted Nazi claims that American wealth was concentrated among a small Jewish elite who exploited the masses. Maria Schmidt, whose diary documented her ideological journey, wrote in her final entry before repatriation, "The most devastating revelation was not merely America's wealth, but its distribution. The cowboys and lumberjacks we were taught to ridicule as primitive servants of Jewish masters are in fact independent men who own property, vote in elections, and speak their minds without fear. Their material comfort exceeds that of our professional classes. This is not the America we were taught to expect, and its existence makes our sacrifices seem not just futile but obscene." The end of the European conflict in May 1945 brought new challenges as the prisoners confronted the prospect of returning to a defeated Germany. Having witnessed American abundance and begun the process of ideological reconstruction, many feared returning to the deprivation and chaos of their homeland. Camp records indicate that 67 of the 342 female German prisoners at Camp Trinidad formally applied for permission to remain in the United States rather than face repatriation. Helga Schneider, whose encounter with American cowboys had begun her journey of disillusionment, wrote in her application, "I cannot return to a nation built on lies. Here I have seen what abundance is possible when society is organized around production rather than conquest. The cowboys and workers who were figures of mockery in our propaganda are in fact men of dignity and capability. I wish to stay and learn from the nation that defeated us, not just through arms, but through the productive power of freedom." While these requests were denied due to repatriation agreements, they reflected the profound transformation these women had undergone. For them, the cowboys and lumberjacks of American propaganda had been revealed not as myths, but as representatives of a system capable of generating unprecedented material. Abundance, a system that had rendered the Nazi vision of society obsolete through productive capacity rather than military might. As repatriation began in late 1945, American intelligence officers conducted exit interviews with departing prisoners. These interviews revealed the extent of their psychological transformation. When asked what they would tell their compatriots about America, 89% indicated they would emphasize American material abundance as the primary factor in Germany's defeat. 73% specifically mentioned encountering real-life versions of propaganda caricatures, cowboys, lumberjacks, and factory workers, as a turning point in their understanding. Captain Erica Lehman's exit interview, preserved in military archives, offers a concise summary of this perspective. I will tell them that Germany lost the war in the factories of Detroit and on the farms of the Midwest long before the first American soldier landed in Europe. I will tell them that the cowboys and lumberjacks we mocked in our propaganda films drive better automobiles than our generals and live in larger homes than our officials. And I will tell them that rebuilding Germany means learning from the nation that defeated us through production rather than conquest. The lasting impact of this experience extended far beyond the war years. Post-war studies of German reintegration conducted by Allied occupation authorities found that former prisoners who had been held in America became important vectors for democratic ideas and economic restructuring. Having witnessed the material results of American production methods and social organization, they brought first-hand testimony that countered lingering Nazi ideological claims and supported Reconstruction efforts. Dr. Heinrich Weber, who conducted interviews with returned prisoners for the Allied Control Commission in 1947, noted, "Former prisoners who encountered American abundance firsthand have become our most effective advocates for economic restructuring. They speak with authority when they describe American productive capacity, and their testimony carries weight precisely because they began as skeptics." When a former Wehrmacht nurse tells her community that American cowboys live better than German doctors, people listen and begin to question the foundations of their previous beliefs. The female prisoners, who had experienced this journey of discovery, played a particularly significant role in post-war German society. Their positions in families, communities, and workplaces allowed them to share their observations with broad networks, accelerating the process of ideological reconstruction. Their testimony helped Germans understand that their defeat resulted not from some sinister conspiracy, but from the simple reality of American productive superiority, a reality embodied in the cowboys and lumberjacks who had once seemed mere propaganda inventions. Decades later, historians would identify this process of disillusionment through material evidence as a crucial factor in Germany's successful democratic transition. Unlike abstract political re-education, the confrontation with American abundance provided concrete, undeniable proof that Nazi ideology had fundamentally misrepresented reality. The cowboys and lumberjacks, who had once been figures of ridicule in German propaganda, became symbols of a different understanding of national strength, one based on production rather than conquest, abundance rather than sacrifice, and cooperation rather than domination. In 1973, during the 30th anniversary commemoration of the Tunisia campaign, Helga Schneider, by then an American and a citizen and Colorado rancher's wife, offered perhaps the most fitting epitaph for this chapter of history. The greatest victory America won was not on the battlefield, but in the minds of those who had been taught to hate and fear it. When we saw that the cowboys and lumberjacks of our propaganda were real men living in real abundance, our old world collapsed. In its place grew something new, an understanding that human flourishing comes not from conquest, but from creation, not from domination, but from production. This was the lesson America taught us, not through indoctrination, but through the simple reality of its existence.